guys, so I'm here today to do my February reading wrap up. I read 6 books in the month of February, and in this video I'm going to give you mini reviews of each of them. Let's go in the order I read them, shall we? The first book I completed in the month of February was Eileen by MOSFET. I read this book on my Kindle. I'm pretty sure I got my copy off of NetGalley, so I did get it for free. And this was one of the books that was shortlisted for the 2016 Man Booker Prize, and I had heard such mixed things about this book. People have feelings on this book across the spectrum. I gave it 3 stars, so I'm sitting firmly in the middle apparently. This was kind of sold as a literary crime novel, at least to me. When I heard people speaking about it, that's what I thought it was. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a crime novel because the crime doesn't happen until the end. What you're reading is the build-up to a major event in our narrator's life that changes her life and changes her future, and she's narrating from the future. So she is looking back on these events with hindsight. She sometimes breaks into the narrative with little tidbits about her life now, decades in the future. She's in her early 20s and she lives in a pretty underwhelming town in the United States of America and works as a sort of receptionist at a boys' prison. The actual narrative, when I think about it, didn't actually contain that much in terms of events. Not that much actually happens, but like I said, nearer the end, what draws you into the story is the narrator, because she's a fascinating character that keeps you intrigued. And although I wouldn't necessarily say I was always loving reading this book, I couldn't put it down. I just wanted to keep reading. Our main character is not particularly likeable though. Not that I think she's meant to be, and beyond that she's actually quite gross. So a lot of the stuff she says and does is a little bit disgusting and gross, and it's a little bit gross to read about. I don't know how else to explain it other than that. So it was really hard to pinpoint exactly how I felt about this book. I think it was a really interesting read. It kept me hooked. I think it was a good book. I don't necessarily think it achieved everything it was trying to achieve, and it's not necessarily one I'm going to go off and say to everybody, you must read this book. I then read 2 collections of poetry in the month of February, and I don't want to go into too much detail about them here because I've done a specific dedicated review video where I review the 3 most recent collections of poetry I've read. So the ones I read in February were Black Cat Bone by John Burnside, first collection by John Burnside, although I have read some of his fiction. This is equally as stunning but dark as his fiction, although different, and I really enjoyed reading this collection. Although sometimes I feel like the imagery went a little bit over my head on an initial reading and I had to think about it, I think John Burnside is perfection in his writing, and I would quite happily sit and contemplate all of the poems in here for a very long time. So I would highly recommend his poetry as well as his fiction. I then read Stranger Baby by Emily Berry, again the first collection by this poet I read, and I really enjoyed this. It had a slow start. I was a little bit apprehensive at the beginning whether I was going to enjoy it as much as I did, but as I got into it, it really came together as a collection and I really enjoyed it. It specifically deals a lot with depression and grief, themes I'm not necessarily drawn towards, but I thought Emily Berry painted beautiful and deep pictures with her words, so I really enjoyed it, like I said. But if you want to hear more about either of these 2, I will link that video down below. I then read a novella by China Miéville. This is The Census Taker. This is the first book I've ever read by China Miéville. He usually writes quite surreal stories, often categorized as science fiction, and this one I think, from what I gather, is a little bit different from his other work. It's still very surreal, although I wouldn't necessarily describe it as science fiction, more magic realism. It's also much shorter than all of the other books I've seen by him. His books are usually huge, but I thought if I was going to start a new author, I would start with one of their shorter works. So this is also his most recent work, and I really enjoyed his writing actually. Because it's so short, not a terrible amount happens in it. It's a really interesting narrative from the perspective of a young boy who lives in a very isolated rural area with both of his parents, and at the beginning of the book something happens, some violent act that sends him running to the nearby town looking for help. We then go backwards to before that event, through that event, and after that event through his narrative, and it constantly has you wondering. It's also beautifully writing. I can totally understand why China Miéville has the fan base that he does, because his writing is spectacular, and I'll definitely be checking out more books by him, although I'm a little bit daunted given their size. So if you have a recommendation of somewhere you think I should go next with China Mayville, please do let me know. I then listened to 2 audiobooks in the month of February. Cheekily though, I do actually have physical copies of both of them. And the first one is I Know Why, The Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. So glad I finally read this book. I feel like this is one of those books I've been meaning to read ever since I became an adult and heard about it. Everyone talks about it, people I highly respect rave about it. It's a classic of the memoir non-fiction genre, and it did not disappoint. It wasn't exactly what I expected, but I did really enjoy it, and I was going to read the physical copy until I realised the audiobook was read by Maya Angelou, and there's something very special about listening to a memoir narrated by the person who this happened to, so I had to end up listening to the audiobook. This is actually the first in what I believe are 7 memoirs covering different periods in Maya Angelou's life, and this covered her childhood, growing up in the deep south of America as a young black girl in the 1930s and into the 40s, I believe. So a time where we know sexism and racism were incredibly prevalent, and this book gave you an incredible insight into that period and those experiences, and it was very powerful, and I feel like I learned a lot, and I can understand why it's such an important piece of literature. Some very harrowing things do happen to Maya Angelou, but the book didn't actually have a overarching sense of darkness or loss or disillusion with it. It actually felt quite hopeful, and just the true story of a girl having to keep going and live her life, and that was what struck me the most about it, and I would highly recommend everyone read this, and I will hopefully get to the rest in this series eventually. And this was actually the February pick for the Feminist Orchestra book club. I then listened to the audiobook of Sophia Khan Is Not Obliged by Aisha Malik. You might have heard me talk about this when I was about halfway through in what was a currently reading video that I did, and I really enjoyed doing that video, so I might make those a monthly thing and do them about mid-month if you guys also enjoy them. This book is the story of Sophia Khan, a young Muslim woman, I think she's about 30, who lives in London and works as a publicist in a publishing house and ends up with a publishing deal to write a Muslim dating book. So this book is about her life, going about her life, dating and just hanging out with friends, and also trying to write this book. It's been compared a lot to Bridget Jones, and I can see why. There's a lot of similarities to Bridget Jones, but in the first half I did feel a little bit like it was too similar to Bridget Jones. Thankfully though, in the second half there were a lot more twists and turns, veered off in different directions, and things happened that made me feel as though it wasn't as similar to Bridget Jones, although I still think there was an overarching sense of Bridget Jonesiness to it. It did have its own voice by the end, and I was really pleased about that, so I ended up really enjoying this one. It's quite light-hearted, but it was also quite important for me because it was obviously from the perspective of somebody who has a very different cultural background from what I do, somebody who's religious and specifically Muslim, and her experience of the dating world, and it's good to see more books like this breaking into the mainstream market, so I really enjoyed that about it. But it was just a really fun, good book as well, and I've already started the sequel because I enjoyed it so much and just want to keep going because it's just really engrossing. Those are all the books I completed in the month of February. However, I am in the middle of reading a few books. If you want to hear my thoughts on some of the books I'm partly through, then I'll link my currently reading video down below, because I did talk about a few books that I haven't since finished, so you might be interested to hear about those. But until then, do let me know if you have any thoughts on the books I mentioned in this video, and until next time guys, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye!